You are muted, Cindy.
Unmuted.
Oh, there you go.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It's one of a series of webinars that we are offering for community foundations, and also welcome some of our friends and colleagues in our communities across country. And so really pleased that you could join us today on today's session around working remotely. If you have not already done so, please make sure that you are on mute and off video. This really just helps with our bandwidth, and as we know, everybody's working remotely these days, and so if you can do that, that would be great. James, next slide, please.
Sure.
So a couple of things before we get into the content, but my name is Cindy Lindsay, and I'm the Director of Learning and Network Engagement with Community Foundations of Canada, and welcome. I'm also really pleased to introduce our presenter today. It is James Law. And James is the Director of Innovation and Business Development based out of Toronto with an organization called Grant Book. So if you're not familiar with Grant Book, take a look at what they do. And James, you might want to spend give us a 20-second spiel when you get underway here. But really pleased that James could step up and during this time and offer some insight around how the best practices and ways and strategies around how we can engage in virtual meetings. So thank you, James, and welcome.
Of course.
Next slide. So just a couple of reminders, if you haven't participated in any of our webinars before, we do have everyone on mute and have asked that you also go off video, so you can hear us, but we can't hear you. We are recording this presentation and it will be available in our resource library following today's presentation. So just give us a little bit of time to get this processed and loaded. As you know, we are curating a lot of material right now, and so it might just take us a little bit of time. For the best webinar experience, please close all other applications. Again, it helps with your bandwidth. And make sure your volume's up, and as I said, mute yourself. Lots of people have been introducing themselves in the chat box, which is great. And as we explore different things, if you do have questions, we are using the chat box function. So while we have James for this hour, if you do have specific things you want to address or need clarification on, please do so, and we will save some time at the end for some questions. And if we do run out of time, we will do some follow-up. Next box, or next slide. So before we jump into the content, I just want to make sure that for those of you with community foundations that you have looked at our home site, our homepage of communityfoundations.ca, and looked at our COVID-19 resources. We also distributed a weekly digest that went out on Friday to your inbox, and really encourage you, if you haven't looked at it yet, to do so. We will be issuing these once a week, just with some updates on what's happening across the movement, what's also any important resources or material that you need to take a look at. And so it's pretty critical. I think in this time, I know we're all getting flooded in our inbox, but please take a look at it and it should help you with your work. Next slide, please. On that COVID-19 page is a number of things. So I mentioned the weekly digest, our disaster strikes guide for community foundations. We are in the process, we started before all this hit, we started the process of updating it, but it's still some really good relevant material in there. So there's a wide range of resources, and so please take a look at everything and see how it can apply to your work and what you're dealing with in your community. Next slide. So I'm going to turn this over to James now. James, if you wanted to just take a few minutes to introduce yourself and the work of Grant Book, and then jump into the content today.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Cindy. Hello, everybody. My name is James Law. As Cindy said, I'm the Director of Innovation and Business Development at Grant Book. Grant Book is a organization that helps grant-making organizations, from foundations to agencies, with their digital transition. So we've been helping many organizations over the past 8 years sort of pick technology that works for them, implement it, do training, and see how it works out. But really what I'm here to talk about today is what we've learned over the past 8 years about working remotely. Grantbook itself as an organization has been doing remote work over this entire time that we've been around. And we have a few lessons learned and experiences from working with organizations as well. Cindy and I have also been doing research into what a bunch of other associations and webinars have been offering in terms of tips and tricks, and so we're looking to aggregate it all for you today. I'm gonna try to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes today, and then leave time at the end for questions, conversations, etc. So the topics for today, what we want to cover is a little bit about the place and context of where remote meetings and meeting facilitation falls into the broader discourse around remote work. Talk a little bit about the tone and environment that's important to set for remote meetings to be effective. Different things to consider when you're facilitating remote meetings. So how are you going to engage based on a variety of criteria? Roles and responsibilities in preparing and executing a meeting. How to manage expectations before, during, and after a meeting. Some norms and culture you can build in your organization around remote work, which a lot of us are finding ourselves in now. And then we'll go into some tech tips. So some technology tools that we've seen ourselves and other orgs use in making remote work effective, and some neat sort of tips around that. Cool. All right, so I want to start a little bit about place and context. So where do these virtual meetings sit? And even if we're talking about internal work here. So meetings really fundamentally are just one part of a larger sort of ecosystem you need to put in place to work effectively. So meetings are ways for us to stay social, stay connected, share ideas effectively, sort of in that middle circle. But they're only going to work well in the long run if you complement it with two other things. So on the left there, you see file sharing, access to information. So if people can't connect to a local server, if it's via VPN, or if they can't connect to sort of a cloud-based data storage solution, then people won't necessarily have access to the files they need to work effectively to prepare for those meetings. The other thing to keep in mind is that you also need systems to help you complete your work. So whether it's processing grants, processing donor requests, whether you're doing sort of collaborations outside of meetings, you also need some web tools to equip you in those scenarios as well. So we're going to talk mainly about meetings today, but keep in mind that if you're not sort of building skills in these other two sections, your meetings may not be as effective in the long run either. All right, so tone and environment. It is a practice makes perfect situation. You know, as I had mentioned, Grantbook and other orgs have, some of us have been working remote for a really long time, but with the changes in the world very recently, many of us are completely new to this. So it is a practice, and we can't expect perfection right now. And that's really important to keep in mind, both to reduce frustration from us individually, but also to provide a space for learning as we move through this process together. Embrace the differences between the benefits of in-person meetings and web meetings. I think sometimes we hold ourselves to a standard to think, well, we're moving to the web, we have Zoom, it should be just as effective as an in-person meeting. It can be just as effective, but there's still going to be differences. You're not going to be able to read body language as well, and you're not going to be able to necessarily catch tone, given that some people are on mute sometimes. So just keep that in mind. Acknowledge those challenges, but there will be some benefits that you can confer as well. We should also accept where we all individually are at. Skill level, sometimes some of us are better at web meetings, and sometimes some of us have different things going on at home. Right now, a lot of us have kids at home, we have pets at home, we have spouses, partners doing different things. So accept those differences, acknowledge that interruptions will happen, and try to move forward with that. I think it's also important right now for this context just to acknowledge the current level of uncertainty and that we are bringing that into the meeting, whether it's remote or not. So that's also an important tone to set. And then we should also reinforce good behaviors right now. So in some cases, maybe in less dramatic times, some people like to use more stick, you know, saying, you know, that meeting wasn't really good, you should have done this in the meeting. But a little bit more calling out what someone did well, good facilitation skills, good meeting practices. When someone does that, use an opportunity to reinforce that and encourage that as we move through this practice together. All right, so time to talk a little bit about an engagement framework. So the process you run a meeting really needs to fit its purpose. And one thing we've seen over our time working remote internally and with sort of larger groups, is there's a little bit of a 2x2 quadrant, a little bit of a spectrum that emerges based on 2 criteria. The first one is meeting size. So the fewer people you have versus the more people you have in a meeting will dictate some differences in how you run it. The second thing to think about are what are the goals of the meeting. If the meeting is really just to share information or inform, you may also need to implement different tools and frameworks than if you're going to be using your meeting to co-create or make a large decision.
Take a picture of that.
This will also be shared out afterwards in a presentation for those who are trying to grab screenshots right now. So if we take a look here, if we're going to have fewer people and the meeting is mainly just to share some information, you may not need that many facilitating roles, or you may not need many supplementary tools, whether it's technology or processes, outside of just Zoom, like we're all doing right now. However, if you have a lot of people in a meeting, even if it's internal, some of us are in organizations that are, 10, 15 plus, and we may be doing some co-creation, some workshopping, some, some process mapping, let's say, then we actually may need more facilitation roles, and we may need to use more tools than just Zoom. We may need better processes in place, and we may need to use some other co-creation tools, which I'll talk about a little later. So, try to keep this in mind. We're all really busy. You may not be able to do this every time, but it's just something to hold in your head as you move forward. So let's talk about some roles and responsibilities. So, every meeting, whether it's big or small, needs a little bit of a meeting master. So the goal of this meeting master, or a facilitator, if you will, is just to keep the meeting purpose and the value of that meeting in check. So they may be in charge of creating the meeting pops and arts, which I'll talk about on the next slide, but really just maintaining the purpose of the meeting, checking at the beginning or before to let everyone know the purpose. They're leading the meeting agenda, they're sending out the invites, and they're also inviting participation from other folks in that meeting. So they have a sort of facilitation role. If someone hasn't spoken, asking them to share if they want to. They're also in charge of being attentive to the meeting scope, time, and next steps. So if the meeting is getting off track, saying that's a good idea, let's put it in a parking lot, and then changing the focus back to the core scope, also watching the time and following up with next steps as required. The meeting master or facilitator should also repeat, summarize things that are being said in the meeting. So, maybe every 5 to 10 minutes, just repeat to the team where they're at, or where the meeting is at, and also do some check-ins with individuals as well at the very beginning. How are we all feeling? As your meeting gets a little bit more complex, either due to size or due to what you're doing, you may need a few other roles. So there's a role where we call key supports. These individuals they help create a positive meeting experience overall and reduce the friction that may exist. So if there's a lot of people talking, this key support may need to actually keep track of the speakers list so that the facilitator can focus on meeting scope. They may help with note-taking, task tracking, so that they can, again, help the facilitator follow up with next steps. Like in Zoom, there's a chat going on the right there, so they may watch chat, like Cindy would be helping with in this case. And they may need to also monitor audio quality. So you'll notice that some people are calling in on their phones sometimes. They may be out in public, even though you really shouldn't be right now. But in other cases, they may be picking up wind, background noise. And so this individual may need to actually go in and proactively mute people just to make the meeting not as frustrating for everybody. And the last role is both during the meeting and sort of in between them. They're subject matter experts and trainers. So the goal of this role is to help the community or our organizations and our stakeholders continue to learn and practice online meetings. So you may task a specific individual to learn more about specific tools and solutions. You may task a team to be online, researching online meeting best practices as we all learn rapidly throughout this time. They may also then train participants on Zoom or other tools before a call if someone is uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and of course contribute to the broader knowledge sharing that the team will have around online meeting practices. So as I mentioned, the facilitator or the meeting master is in charge of creating POPs and arts. And POPs and arts are about managing expectations around online meetings. In particular, you need these when the meeting is more complex. So when there's more people involved or you're going to be doing a lot of activity in a meeting, it's not just sharing information. You want to have these things in place. Generally, each meeting should have a sense of purpose, outcomes, and process. So why you're meeting, what you're looking to get out of it, and then the steps you're going to take to execute on that meeting. Like I said before, if it's a more basic meeting, you may not need that last P very much, because if it's like a 30-minute check-in at the beginning of the week, the process is like, what is everybody up to? What's everyone doing this week? Any challenges? But if the meeting's getting a little bit more complicated, let's say you're going to map out a donor journey, or you're going to think about how you're going to spin up a COVID-19 grant response fund, then your process then needs to involve a series of arts. So arts are basically smaller steps in your process, and each smaller step needs an activity or a topic. So what you're going to do at that step, what is the result you expect from that step, how long is that step going to take in terms of timing, and then what you're actually going to do to execute it. And so here's an example. So let's say we want to develop, we're going to hold a meeting, and the POP that the meeting master should determine is right there. So the purpose of the meeting is we're going to develop a solution to move donor funds quickly to those that have acute needs in our communities right now. So the objective to support that purpose for this meeting is we're going to build a blueprint for how our foundation is going to move money from A to B in the best way possible. And then the third P of the POP, or the second P of the POP, the process, is going to be a series of arts, activities, results, timing, and steps in the process. So the first step we're going to take to achieve this objective is we're going to do a little bit of brainstorming and sharing about what we're hearing about from our donors and for our communities. The result is going to be a list of ideas from that brainstorming. The timing, T, it's going to take about 15 minutes. And the steps we're going to do in this art, we're just going to do popcorn sharing, pretty easy. The next art in that process is we're going to take that brainstorming and we're going to develop some personas. So who are the donors that want to help, and what are some personas from our communities who need maybe different resources right now? The result is going to be 3 to 5 personas for donors and communities. Timing, we're going to spend about 30 minutes doing it, and we're going to do it through small group facilitation. And then it goes on and on. The third step is a service blueprinting for a response fund. And then our fourth process step is a wrap up and next steps. So a meeting master may want to share this out externally if you have a team that really needs to know exactly what is going on. But other times, a meeting master can also just share the POP, but internally in their minds, and maybe with some key supports, work through each of these arts so you know what you're doing, what tools you're going to have to queue up, what frameworks do you need to have in place to run that meeting smoothly. So again, keep in mind, this is all scaling with the complexity of your meeting. If it's easy and a simple meeting, you don't have to put this much time up front. But if you're going to do sort of an hour-and-a-half workshop with your whole team, it's worth doing this to provide for clarity. All right. So norms and culture, reducing friction. So this is about how do you, over time, build a culture of remote work and remote meetings in an organization. And it is sort of a cyclical event. So you're always doing this in cycles, you're always improving. So before a meeting starts, should be obvious, just be clear on what the POPs are when possible. You know, sometimes you can't because we're all super busy, but try to do that. The second thing is be considerate of time zone differences. So if you're working in one community and it's just that team, may not be such a big issue. But if you're working with external stakeholders or you're working internationally or nationally, just be really considerate of time zone differences as you plan out your meetings. Also, before a meeting, it's just really important to check to see if anyone is unfamiliar with tools and to train them up on those tools if they require that training. There's nothing more intimidating or frustrating for someone who's not used Zoom before and not used a collaborative whiteboard tool to be expected just to show up and perform to the same standard as someone who's been doing this for 3 to 4 years. Also, make sure your files are ready and scaffold your meetings. So files, often attach them in the meeting invite if possible. And don't set up your framework for a meeting agenda or a whiteboarding exercise in the meeting live. It sort of takes up a lot of time, and then people just kind of watch you set it up, which isn't always great. During the meeting, we always suggest right now to check in and make room to socialize. So because we're all remote, water cooler conversations, or in some cases, you know, beer fridge conversations or snack cart conversations, those won't be happening as organically anymore. So it's important just to check in with people where they're at. You could try going alphabetically through your team. If it's large, go one way, go another. You could go by seniority, just to make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak about where they are. Contrary to this large webinar right now, I would say in smaller teams when you're trying to work as a team and build that social cohesion, it's good to have your mute off and have your video on where possible. And we say where possible, as Cindy has called out, you know, with some internet infrastructure not being great in some areas, and even great infrastructure being stressed in certain areas, that may not be possible. So be sensitive to you know, bandwidth, but try to have your volume on and try to have your video on to maintain eye contact, etc. So like we were saying, maintaining eye contact, rephrasing, engaging vocally is really important during a meeting to maintain that social connection, and try your best not to multitask. So when you turn your video off and you listen passively, you tend to go on your phone or you tend to go on your internet. Some of you may be in your Gmail right now, and that's okay. But what we really want to do is try to reduce that friction. We want to be able to look at people in the eye and sound back what we're hearing to maintain that connection. So reducing the social distancing in a time of physical distancing. And of course, invite participation. So everyone should be able to speak equally, even if they're not on video. Make sure that the facilitator pulls that person out, asks them for input, and use the speakers list if you need to make space. After the meeting, always send summaries that are easy to read and are tactical, so people know exactly what they need to do and what the outputs were. Store follow-up tasks in an appropriate place. This is what I talked about earlier, where I said meetings are one part of a digital puzzle. If you send it via email, in this day and age, and right now probably, it's gonna get lost in their email. So make sure there's like a collective Google Doc or a project management tool where you're storing some of these tasks. Feel free to debrief with the facilitator and the team on lessons learned at a rhythm, maybe not right after a meeting, but maybe weekly, monthly, just what have we learned as a team about online meetings in our culture, what can we do better? And also encourage the use of these tools outside of work. If you're paying for remote meeting tools like Zoom or GoToMeeting, encourage your team to use those tools for their personal social activities, whether it's getting along with their family or their friends. It's a good way to extend your benefits to your team if you can afford to do so. And it also trains them just to build the tool into their lives, so it's less alien when they're doing it in the office or during work hours in this case. All right, so next I'm going to move on to some really quick tech tips about how you can use a variety of tools effectively to be able to implement some of these recommendations. All right, so tools fit for purpose. So your online work stack is going to consist of multiple things. So for most of your online meetings, you're probably going to be using something like a Zoom or a GoToMeeting here. But keep in mind that in between your meetings, you may actually be using something like a Microsoft Teams or a Slack to be able to have text chat or more high frequency communications. So in a remote work setting, it's not like you can just drop by someone's office, knock on their door and say, hey, do you have, you know, X report, or this donor wants to know the status of their fund balance right now, markets, etc. You can't really just do that. And calling someone on Zoom to do so may be a little bit interruptive. Zoom rings, it pops up in your computer, it's a lot. So having sort of a chat function may be able to address that level of request instead of having to hop on the phone all the time. So this is really about communication. Other things you're going to need to keep in mind, I'm actually going to hop to the right here, is about coordination. So in between all those meetings, how are you keeping track of what everyone's doing? How are you keeping track of where your projects are going? So there are some project management tools out there, work tracking tools like Asana or Trello or Smartsheet that allow you visibility into what your team members are doing so that you can stay up to date even though you're not in a meeting at that moment. And of course, the third pillar that we like to focus on is co-creation. So even within a meeting, what tools can you use to work together? There are whiteboard, mapping, brainstorming tools like Miro, Mural, or Lucidchart. And of course, file sharing and productivity tools are really key right now. So something like G Suite, which includes Google Docs, Google Slides, all that, or Office 365, which is, you know, your Word online, your PowerPoint online, that sort of thing. So specifically within Zoom, like we're all on today, there are actually a few cool things that you can do. If it's enabled by your administrator. If it's not enabled by your Zoom administrator, please ask them to do so. So the first thing are actually Zoom reactions. So one thing that's interesting, I would say, about web conferencing is that when you talk all at the same time, it's a little different than in person. In person, when everyone's talking at the same time, you can try to focus on one conversation. But in a Zoom meeting, whoever sort of talks the loudest sort of interrupts over everybody else. So when someone's giving a presentation and you want to say, yeah, that's a good idea, or just hum an agreement, it'll actually sort of come in and interrupt the meeting, and it can cause a little bit of friction. So Zoom and other tools have invited what we call reactions. Sometimes it's in the chat, sometimes it's right in the user interface, where you can give a clap or you can give a thumbs up to silently express your support for an idea. So if you like what someone's saying, you can add a reaction. This is also really useful if you're in a larger meeting. There you go, Simon, thank you for the thumbs up. If you're in a larger meeting and someone needs to add their name to a speakers list, also feel free to maybe designate one of the reactions or an emoji as a way to say, hey, I want to speak, can you add me to the list? That way that key support role can look for that emoticon or that symbol and add your name to speak next. Also, sharing audio is really key. So I'm sharing my screen right now, but I'm not sharing my computer audio. When you hit share screen in Zoom, you can also choose to share your computer sound, which will mean that any sound that your computer makes, like if you're going to watch a video, will flow through and share it with everyone. We've actually found this really useful to maintain team cohesion and watching webinars together or watching training videos together. You can still do a lot of these things, not in person, but via Zoom. The other thing we've found really useful is actually do this to work quietly together while playing some music in the background. So if you're like, I want to work in silence, I want to work alone, that's fine. But for some offices, they actually like to be on Zoom with each other. They're all muted. Someone's streaming their music, and they're all just sort of working in a room. And that just sort of helps them maintain that sense of social cohesion. And then the last thing I want to show here for Zoom, I think, is annotations. So in Zoom, you can actually use this annotate function, and this is in other platforms as well, where you can actually draw on the screen when someone's screen sharing to annotate what's on the screen. So I'm just going to play this video here. So let's say I was sharing a Syria response report with my team, and we all wanted to sort of just like make some comments as to what we liked or didn't like. So people can actually draw on the screen, circle things and say, I didn't understand that. They could make comments on what they like in the presentation or expand on more of the information. So this is a way when someone's giving a presentation, people can start adding notes. Obviously, this can get really out of hand really quick and can get very distracting. So use it as necessary, but it is a good tool to keep in mind. Oh, and the last one is file sharing. And chat. So the chat function is really important. You've all discovered it, obviously, already. But it is also a place to share links to files directly in the text if people didn't get files ahead of time. And in Zoom, you can actually share a file directly from your file storage. Bless you to whoever sneezed, on your file storage as well. Cool. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit is about whiteboarding. So sometimes you'll want to do actually a brainstorming process. And so a tool like Miro is actually a way where two people can simultaneously write on the same whiteboard at the same time. So this is me and my colleague Jen. Jen is the orange pointer and mine is the dark black pointer. So this is a way we wanted to brainstorm on what we know, wonder, and what we're going to learn about working remotely. So we can collectively put Post-its on a board, we can share ideas, we can move things around. And this is just a way for people not only to talk in a meeting, but also contribute in a written way to an overall brainstorm in order to create content. So this way, the facilitator isn't responsible for like listening to a recording of a meeting again and having to create an output. You can actually all co-create the output in the same meeting live. We find this really important as well for process mapping, especially if you folks are going to be, thinking about how to spin up new donor funds, new granting programs. It's just a really good way to leave with a really concrete deliverable from, let's say, a meeting that lasts an hour or so. All right. And then I think one of the other tool tips I want to really raise is that we talked a lot about needing to procure fit for purpose tools. So like you have a Zoom, for example, for meetings, and then I talked about using Miro for whiteboarding. But you can also just use stuff that you already have in your stack. So for example, in your G Suite or in your Word online doc, everyone can go to the same document at the same time and see someone working on it. So you could actually keep your speakers list ongoing in a document. People can have it open to the side. They can see who's speaking up next, etc. So you know where you are in your queue. And of course, if you don't have the capacity right now to buy a tool like Miro or Lucidchart, you could use Google Slides or PowerPoint online to work together on sort of like a process map or a brainstorming exercise. So there are cases to be made for repurposing existing tools that are affordable for a lot of these online working purposes. Cool. So that's it for the extent of sort of like the tips I wanted to share for today in sort of a presentation format. That took about 30 minutes like I had thought. Cindy, how are you feeling? Should we open up to discussion now, answer some questions?
Yeah, we can certainly open it up to any questions folks might have. This was a really quick overview. There is one question about how does Microsoft Word get shared among colleagues when you're doing something like this?
So sharing the desktop version of Microsoft Word online, sharing the desktop version of Microsoft Word probably isn't the best practice to be using in this case. You want to take it closer to what Google Docs does. So for example, you'd want to actually use Microsoft Word Online. So it would be the version of Word that loads in your browser, and that provides for more co-creation, collaboration, seeing what other people are at, versus the desktop version. That can be a little heavy and messy.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question around, is there anything about Zoom that would make it an inappropriate platform for an AGM? So we have a lot of community foundations coming up to holding their annual general meetings. It's that time of year in the next coming months. And so, you know, looking at their bylaws, whether they can do this electronically. And so, you know, trying to determine what's the best way to do this. And I don't think it would be inappropriate platform, James, but I think back to your earlier information around how do you help people and support people who may not be familiar with a platform like this.
Mm-hmm. I think when you're holding an AGM with a lot of people, your main challenges are going to be around validating users. So who join is that actual person. So you're going to want to make sure that you're compliant with that in a way that works for your team. And then, of course, the facilitation. So muting people, unmuting people, you're going to probably need a few key supports, those roles. You're going to want someone monitoring the chat. As well. So I wouldn't say it would be unmanageable. Zoom is being used by many organizations with hundreds and hundreds of employees to sort of have group meetings. It's going to be the facilitation that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Yeah, which I think is obvious. So in some ways, I would really suggest that the team really thinks about how you're going to do it ahead of time. I would invite maybe a smaller group of volunteers if you can get access to them with maybe other orgs, so not necessarily your members, but just other orgs to kind of test that out and do a bit of a community group learning exercise, take turns facilitating, train yourself and practice. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I think as we head into this time of AGMs, CFC will come out with some tips and best practices on how community foundations can do that. A question around how you build or co-create service blueprint together online.
Sure. So for those who may not know, a service blueprint is really just a map of how your organization does some things, and then sort of the people and the technology involved in each step. So let's say you're talking about how to spin up a new response fund. Sorry, the clicking is probably distracting. Not good practice. If you're thinking about how to spin up a response fund, let's say, and you're doing this in a meeting together and everyone has ideas, you want to be sort of mapping out ideas on the steps from 1 to 10, how this would work. And then you start asking questions like, oh, well, who's going to handle the intake and triage? What tool are we going to use? So that's what a blueprint is. So the way that we have been doing it together with our internal colleagues, and we've been doing it with external folks again, is via a tool like Miro that we showed here, or you could do it in PowerPoint online or Google Slides online as well. All you have to do is make sure that everyone has their own license to use Miro. So that you can sort of have your mice working at the same time. Like I said, you can be dropping process step boxes everywhere. You can be dropping ideas and questions. You could also in Miro pay for daily passes to invite in external stakeholders. So I think there's another webinar on sort of engaging and working tomorrow, but if you're going to be, let's say, bringing in community members to help brainstorm with you, you can actually pay for day passes. I think it's like $3 a day or something like that, depending on the tool, for them just to be able to hop into your map here, co-create with you, share together, laugh together, that sort of thing. Again, because there's gonna be so many people working at the same time, you still need a facilitator. Just like how in an in-person meeting, a brainstorming meeting, there's someone watching the clock, there's someone grouping things, you're still gonna need a facilitator in this circumstance and situation to rally the conversation.
Great, thank you. Any suggestions or best practices you could recommend for more popcorn style updates to avoid people talking over each other? You know, I think just that simple chat box function as people sign in to just do a quick update is an easy step. But do you have any other suggestions, James?
Yeah, and I think we've seen this be recommended a few times, like in sort of nonprofit tech resources or general meeting facilitation resources. Popcorn in a room is easy because everyone can sort of raise their hands, but you may want to do a little bit of a more ordered process to see if it works first. So some places like to go by, as I mentioned before, you could say by first name alphabetical. You know, you may want to actually say, you know, person A, do you have, person name starts with A, do you have any thoughts, B, C, D, E? If you feel like that's a little too stagnant, then that expert sort of meeting facilitation thing comes in about raising your hands, a speakers list. Also, you could feel free to actually use a whiteboard tool or something like Google Slides to do the popcorning. So instead of speaking aloud, people may be actually able to write their ideas, and the facilitator's job then is to start grouping those, because the popcorn is just throwing ideas out and you're going to look for trends. So the facilitator may quietly in the background be actually grouping those thoughts together and then seeing the trends that emerge, and people can sort of respond from there. What's important about popcorn style in the setting is if you notice someone hasn't spoken yet, please encourage them to do so. It can be a little daunting right now to speak up.
Especially, yes, especially if you're unfamiliar with this technology, that's for sure. You know, a question around how do we involve individuals that have disabilities with these types of meetings? Do you have any thoughts around that, James?
This is a challenging one to answer because I'm not an expert, and I first want to say that. But in terms of what we've seen folks be able to implement are actually technologies that are a little bit more native to the desktop itself. So I think in many cases, and if anyone has ideas or experience, please feel free to share this in the chat because we want to be able to co-create this together. The presence of screen readers has become very important. There are a lot of accessibility options at an operating level system that I think are really important for you to explore with your team members as well, if this is a need for them. In terms of like the tools right now, so let's say the whiteboarding tool, it is very mouse and pointer heavy. So what you would have to explore right now, if someone does have trouble using these devices, is procurement of accessibility driven hardware. There are quite a few options out there. They're not cheap though. And so that's one thing we would really have to explore.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things that CFC is going to look at how community foundations for AGMs, that type of thing, and even as we move our granting into being online, because we don't want to be handling a lot of paper or having people mail things in, how do we ensure that everybody has access to a computer to do that type of work? And so as we move very quickly and deeply into this digital access, it's a burning question, and we're always learning and looking at new ways of doing things. So it's you know, we'll be sharing more about that as we move forward. And
maybe just sorry, Cindy, just to add to that, yeah. So some products like Zoom, for example, and other ones, they can integrate with closed captioning tools too. So if you have those who are hard of hearing or have difficulty hearing, if they have a closed captioning tool available, it can be integrated. And some Zoom, there is an option if you pay for it, it can do automated transcripts as well. So someone could technically read the conversation afterwards, though I know that is not participating, that's just reading, but that is an option.
Yeah. Any other questions, folks? Please feel free to pop them in while we've got James available. I will remind you that, you know, we're offering a webinar on Thursday afternoon, and that will focus on more around the facilitation tools and how you engage. So, you know, James has given us a great overview today, and then our colleagues at Overlap Associates will be going a little deeper in terms of how we can leverage this in order to have everyone participate. Yeah, and just, oh, here's a tip from Kelly at McConnell. Thanks, Kelly. Using Zoom as your go-to platform for socializing with friends, absolutely. And it's fun. We get to learn a lot more, and I think we're seeing people do this more and more, and so that you become more fluent in Zoom. So, and as James said at the beginning, and it's a bit of our mantra here at CFC, it doesn't need to be perfect, and so because we're all learning this together. Thanks for sharing that, Kelly. Any other key thoughts, James, as we come to wrap up here?
On the meeting front, not particularly. I think one thing, I saw another point there about, is there an assumption that members have access to a computer, smartphone, et cetera, to vote? I think that's a really good point. You know, you'll always be able to dial in, but as for the compliance around voting, I think that's really something for us to continue to consult with our legal officers about in all of this. I think the last thought is that, any final thoughts? I do want to come back to this idea of place and context. You know, I've been doing an interview with some community foundations across the states right now about digital maturity, et cetera. And one thing that's sort of really come up in a lot of these conversations is that those who have the other, you know, two sections of file sharing and systems, who have them in place and have had them for years, you know, if they already moved off FIMS or something like that, you know, for example, it's just that much easier to layer this on top. Whereas those that are just starting to move now, the meetings aren't effective because they don't really have access to other sources of information. So it's a little bit difficult if you're just getting started. I know it's a lot to sort of consume and you're thinking, how am I going to do this? But it is really important to move all these pillars at the same time for you to be effective in the long run. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Tanya, thanks for this great tip. So if you're presenting in presenting mode on Google Slides, you can turn on Google's closed captioning and it will show through Zoom.
Perfect.
Not too sure if you can do that, James.
Yeah, I think I can do it right now. Yeah, so you can see it down at the bottom there. Thanks for that, Tanya. I actually think PowerPoint Online also has this, or PowerPoint Desktop via the Azure integration that they have in the back. So it's actually pretty good. There you go.
That's terrific. Yeah, oh, I love that. I didn't realize that. That's something I knew today. And I know we've talked a lot about using Zoom as the platform, but there are other platforms that work very similar to this. And do you want to just take a quick second to maybe highlight what those might be, James?
Yeah, sure. I think there's actually quite a, I don't know if I should leave the closed captioning on. so self-conscious now. There's a few out there. There's also you know, there's GoToMeeting that we have talked about. There's a lot of new ones that are popping up as well. I think there's like Assembly, there's like, there's quite a few now options that are popping out. One way to do it is to go to, you could go to Gartner or you can go to Capterra. Capterra is a really good resource for looking up online tools and options around online tools as well. So for example, even if I go to Zoom, Capterra, you see it belongs in the web conferencing software. And there's actually a bunch of ones that are listed here. Here, you could then sort by pricing options. So is it free? Are there free trials? You could sort by highest rated as well. Keep in mind, you want to balance that with most reviews. And this is a way for you to be able to sort them. But you see sort of the biggest ones right now, Google Hangouts, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, Join Me, that sort of thing. Now, when you're looking up these things, just be very aware that Zoom and Google Hangouts, even though they're put in the same category, they don't do the same thing. So Google Hangouts will let us do sort of smaller team chats, but don't try to use Google Hangouts to do a 100-person AGM. That's not going to work for you. So you're going to have to pay attention to some of these differences. Yeah.
Great. Are these for global meetings? The question, like Zoom works internationally. I was on a Zoom call, Zoom meeting the other day with about 300 people from around the world, and so they do work there's no borders with some of these programs as well. How hard is it to invite external participants to teams that, like the Microsoft?
It is not that able to do so. If you're going to be doing a lot of file sharing in particular, Teams is really integrated with SharePoint. Like you can definitely upload files to Teams and have it there, but it's very integrated to SharePoint. So if you're going to be doing a large, complicated project with external participants in Teams, then keep in mind that you're probably going to have to design the SharePoint fairly well as well. But if you're talking about just like a day-to-day chat, it's not that difficult. One interesting thing I saw on Verge this morning, which is like a tech blog, Slack and Teams are working on an integration so that if I work in Teams, I can actually ring someone in Slack, which is really interesting because it shows collaboration versus competition in this time. Not going to be anytime soon, but something curious to think about. So if your external stakeholder or the person you're inviting is on Slack, that may not be a challenge much longer. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So folks, James, if you just want to flip again to those last couple of slides, we'll wrap things up now.
Sure.
Just a reminder for people to, if you're interested in our upcoming webinars for community foundations, stay tuned. We do have the one this coming Thursday on remote facilitation, one on April 14th, sharing some stories and best practices around how we steward donors and community foundations during the turbulent times. We're also coming up with some webinars and resources related to governance, HR practices, and business continuity. So lots going on in these next few weeks, so stay tuned. So James, I can't say thank you enough. I really appreciate you giving us this crash course on how to plan and be more strategic around animation. And I think, you know, the old adage of practice, practice, practice also makes us more comfortable with this. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for your time, everybody. I appreciate it as well.
Okay. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.